Most people believe Europe's future was decided in grand palaces and signed treaties, but in truth, it was settled on a muddy field in Belgium, in a single day when one delayed order, one exhausted charge, and one unexpected arrival quietly ended an era and reshaped an entire continent forever. In this film, you will witness how one battle redirected Europe's destiny, revealing the hidden decisions, fragile moments, and lasting consequences that turned a single day of chaos into a century of change. Few people alive in early June 1815 understood that Europe's fate was narrowing toward a damp stretch of Belgian farmland, because while diplomats argued borders in Vienna and monarchs celebrated restored crowns, one man was quietly marching north, determined to force history to bend back in his direction. Europe had barely caught its breath after 2 decades of war, as empires exhausted by the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte tried to stitch together a fragile peace, believing exile had finally ended the age of endless battles. Yet beneath that calm surface, old powers felt threatened again. New ideas of nation and sovereignty refused to die, and armies across the continent remained uneasy, half ready for another storm. When Napoleon escaped Elba in March 1815 and reclaimed Paris without firing a shot, the balance collapsed instantly, pushing Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia into hurried alliance, not for conquest, but survival, knowing that if Napoleon struck first, Europe's future would be decided on his terms. By mid-June, nearly 200,000 soldiers moved across Belgium, boots sinking into rain-soaked fields, commanders racing against time, because Napoleon understood one truth clearly. He had to defeat the Allied armies separately before they could unite. Near the village of Waterloo, on June 18, 1815, that race reached its limit, as French forces faced the Duke of Wellington's army, with Prussian reinforcements still uncertain, delayed, and desperately needed. What followed would hinge on timing, terrain, and a single day of decisions made under mud, smoke, and pressure. And as clouds gathered overhead, Europe stood unknowingly at the edge of a moment that would end an era, or revive it. And as dawn broke over the battlefield, one question remained unanswered: whether this would be Napoleon's final stand, or the beginning of another continental nightmare. By the night of June 17, 1815, nearly 250,000 men were converging on a narrow stretch of land in Belgium, not by accident, but by momentum built from years of war, ambition, and unfinished reckoning that neither side could escape anymore. On one side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, commanding roughly 72,000 French troops, veterans hardened by campaigns across Europe, men who believed their emperor was destiny made flesh, trusting his speed, his instincts, and the legacy of victories that had once reshaped the map itself. Facing him was an uneasy coalition led by the Duke of Wellington, an Anglo-Allied force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German soldiers, supported by the approaching Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, whose arrival could decide everything, if time allowed it. Each commander trusted plans drawn from experience and numbers calculated carefully, yet beneath maps and formations laid out, because coordination was fragile, communication slow, and the weather unforgiving, turning roads into mud and plans into estimates. As dawn approached, movement began almost without command, columns advancing, artillery rolling forward, cavalry shifting position, every step closing the final distance between belief and reality, while retreat quietly vanished as an option. Napoleon knew delay favored his enemies. Wellington knew survival depended on holding ground long enough for Prussia to arrive, and Blücher, wounded days earlier, pressed his exhausted men forward with stubborn resolve, aware that history was tightening its grip. The key moment approached not with a single order, but with the realization that all paths now led forward, that caution had expired, and that Europe's future would be decided by whose confidence endured longest under pressure. As the army settled into position, unaware of how thin their margins truly were, the stage was set for the first violent test, one that would shatter assumptions and expose the cost of faith and destiny. The first shots of the battle rang out with sudden violence on the morning of June 18, 1815, as cannons shattered the early calm, and columns of French infantry, led by Napoleon himself, surged forward with the confidence of men who had believed in their invincibility, only to find the ground ahead far less yielding than expected. while Allied troops under the Duke of Wellington braced in disciplined squares, their eyes fixed on the horizon where smoke and dust twisted like a warning that certainty had already begun to slip. From the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, the battlefield seemed to fracture into chaos within moments, as French artillery crews struggled through mud, cavalry advanced and retreated in waves, and messengers dashed between units, carrying orders that were often delayed or misheard, while confusion rippled through both sides, leaving soldiers and officers alike grappling with the sudden collapse of early expectations. And yet, amidst the fear, a strange energy emerged, the kind that sharpens senses and tests instinct, forcing commanders to adapt not according to plans, but to the raw and unfolding reality of combat, where every footstep, every volley, carried consequences far beyond the map. Marshal Ney, seeing the center of Wellington's line, committed to cavalry charges that thundered forward, sabers raised, yet the disciplined infantry held firm, turning momentum into costly frustration. And in that tense exchange, it became clear that what had begun as a measured engagement was transforming into a relentless contest, where survival, not victory, dictated the rhythm of the day, and no man could predict which flank would bend first. As smoke thickened and the sounds of battle swelled into a grim symphony of struggle and endurance, the early shock settled into a slow, uneasy understanding across the field that this encounter would last far longer than anyone had imagined, and that the true cost of ambition was only beginning to reveal itself. By early afternoon on June 18, 1815, something subtle but dangerous began to change across the battlefield, because although the fighting had been relentless, victory had not arrived where Napoleon expected it to, and time, once his greatest ally, was quietly turning against him. Hours of assaults had drained strength from both sides, yet the balance no longer felt equal. As French infantry grew weary from repeated advances uphill, artillery crews struggled through mud, and confidence slowly thinned under constant resistance. In this tension, Marshal Michel Ney made a decision born from urgency rather than clarity, launching massive cavalry charges against Wellington's center, believing the Allied line was breaking. Thousands of horsemen thundered forward in waves, sabers raised, yet the infantry squares held firm, disciplined, unmoving, turning speed and courage into costly exhaustion. Each failed charge consumed men and momentum, while hesitation crept into French command, as Napoleon waited for the perfect moment that never fully arrived. Across the ridge, Wellington sensed a shift, ordering reinforcements with measured calm, knowing endurance was now his strongest weapon, while distant cannon fire from the east hinted at something far more dangerous for France, the approach of Prussian forces under Blucher, still unseen, but no longer uncertain. Soldiers on both sides felt it in their bones, the strange awareness that history had begun to lean, not suddenly, but steadily. The true turning point came not with collapse, but with realization, when French attacks no longer gained ground, when exhaustion replaced belief, and when delay allowed the battlefield itself to choose a direction that could not be reversed. As shadows lengthened and pressure mounted from every side, the battle moved beyond tactics into inevitability, and what came next would decide whether Napoleon's gamble ended in survival or final ruin. The decisive moment did not arrive with a trumpet call or a single command, but with a slow realization spreading across the battlefield, as late afternoon shadows stretched longer and the sound of distant guns grew closer from the east, carrying consequences no one could ignore. By around 6 p.m. on June 18, 1815, Napoleon committed his last reserves, the Imperial Guard, a force long considered invincible, sending them uphill toward Wellington's thinning center near Mont Saint-Jean. These veterans had broken armies before, and their advance carried both fear and hope, yet the field they crossed was scarred, crowded, and confused, littered with exhausted units and broken formations. Wellington, sensing the weight of the moment, exposed himself openly, steadying wavering troops, while Blucher's Prussian forces finally struck the French right flank at Plancenoit, stretching French command beyond recovery. Orders conflicted, messengers vanished, and leadership on all sides faced pressure measured not in plans, but seconds. The turning point arrived when the Imperial Guard faltered, then stopped, then turned back, meeting disciplined volleys and unyielding resistance, as morale cracked visibly and the myth of inevitability collapsed in full view of thousands. That retreat rippled instantly across the French line, breaking cohesion and belief together. From that moment, the battle's verdict became clear, as survival replaced strategy, control dissolved into reaction, and Europe's future quietly shifted direction on a muddy ridge in Belgium. And as panic spread through retreating ranks, one final question remained unresolved: whether defeat would end the war, or merely transform it into something even more dangerous. Few moments in battle unfold so completely that doubt disappears, because as evening settled over Waterloo on June 18, 1815, the sound of retreat replaced the sound of command, and certainty arrived not as hope, but as collapse. Once the Imperial Guard fell back, order unraveled with terrifying speed, as French units that had held for hours began to withdraw without coordination, formations dissolving into crowded roads and muddy fields, while Prussian forces pressed harder from the east and Wellington's line surged forward with renewed strength. Commands were shouted, then lost. Officers tried to rally men who no longer believed rallying could save them, and fear moved faster than any messenger could. What began as a controlled withdrawal quickly became disorder, as artillery was abandoned, wounded left behind, and entire units broke apart under the weight of realization that the battle was no longer contestable. Napoleon attempted to stem the tide, positioning rear guards and issuing orders meant to restore control, yet the battlefield no longer responded to authority, only instinct, as survival replaced discipline and memory replaced hope. Soldiers sensed something deeper than defeat, an understanding that this was not just another lost field, but the end of an era they had lived and fought within for years, one now collapsing around them in real time. The key moment arrived when resistance finally failed across the line, not with one final charge, but with a collective turning away, as thousands accepted that holding ground no longer mattered, because the outcome had already been written into the smoke and mud. As darkness closed in and the roads filled with fugitives, the battle faded behind them, but its consequences were only beginning to take shape, reaching far beyond the night and into the future of Europe itself. By the morning of June 19, 1815, the battlefield no longer echoed with cannon fire or shouted orders, because silence had settled over Waterloo, broken only by wind, distant groans, and the quiet realization that history had already moved on without asking permission. As the light revealed the ground, loss became impossible to ignore. Fallen soldiers scattered across fields and roads, uniforms torn and stained, weapons abandoned where strength had failed, while medics and survivors moved slowly among them, searching for signs of life rather than victory. Wellington walked the field in measured silence, later calling it the saddest sight he had ever witnessed, because triumph offered no comfort when measured against the cost required to achieve it. Blucher arrived soon after, not as a conqueror, but as a man counting consequences, aware that Napoleon's defeat ended one danger while leaving another question unanswered: how Europe would live with the peace it had just forced into existence. The focus shifted away from fighting toward meaning, as commanders assessed what had been preserved and what had been permanently lost. Knowing borders could be redrawn, but lives could not be restored. Across Europe, news would travel slowly, and reactions would remain cautious, because this was not a victory that inspired celebration, but one that demanded reflection. The turning point of this quiet phase came with understanding rather than action, as leaders accepted that the old cycle of war had reached its breaking point, and that restraint now mattered as much as strength once had. And as Europe paused in collective uncertainty, standing between relief and exhaustion, the deeper consequences of Waterloo began to form, shaping decisions that would echo far beyond the battlefield and into the fragile peace ahead. Within days of Waterloo, couriers crossed Europe at exhausting speed, because the meaning of the battle mattered as much as its outcome, and every capital needed to understand how power had shifted before someone else acted first. In London, celebration was measured and cautious, shaped by relief rather than triumph, while in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, leaders read the same reports with different calculations in mind, aware that Napoleon's defeat removed a threat, but also removed the pressure that had held fragile alliances together. The coalition that had united out of necessity now faced a quieter challenge, deciding how much strength to maintain and how much restraint to show. Knowing that dominance too openly displayed could invite new rivalries. France itself entered a moment of uncertainty. As authority fractured and ambition retreated inward, the question no longer how to conquer Europe, but how to survive within it. The key moment shifted away from the battlefield and into council chambers, where maps replaced muskets, and decisions carried consequences measured in decades rather than days. Rulers weighed stability against influence, punishment against reconciliation, and remembered how easily fear had once driven them into endless war. The turning point of this political phase arrived when it became clear that no single power could dominate Europe without triggering resistance, forcing monarchs to accept balance as the new currency of control, even if it limited their reach. As nations adjusted to this unexpected equilibrium, curiosity replaced certainty, because beneath the surface calm, Europe sensed that peace built on restraint would demand discipline, and the next chapter of history would test whether that lesson could endure. The most powerful changes after Waterloo were not drawn with ink or enforced by armies, because while borders on maps remained mostly familiar, influence shifted quietly, altering Europe's direction without announcing itself. In the months following June 1815, the Congress of Vienna worked to restore balance, reinforcing monarchies and reaffirming boundaries. Yet the true transformation unfolded beneath these formal decisions, as France's dominance faded and Britain's confidence expanded through naval strength and global trade. Prussia emerged with renewed purpose, its military reforms validated, while Austria and Russia recalibrated their ambitions, cautious not to ignite the same forces they had just suppressed. Across the continent, leaders spoke of stability, but remembered how fragile stability could be when power concentrated too tightly in one place. The focus moved toward long-term consequences rather than immediate control, as governments invested in alliances, deterrence, and diplomacy, attempting to prevent the return of continental war through shared restraint rather than conquest. At the same time, ideas born during revolution and empire refused to disappear, lingering among populations who had tasted change and now understood its possibility. The turning point of this era arrived not through battle, but through acceptance, as Europe collectively stepped onto a path defined by balance of power, aware that peace depended on cooperation as much as strength, and that dominance carried risks no nation could afford alone. Yet beneath this careful order, uncertainty remained, because history rarely rests, and as Europe adjusted to its new direction, the question lingered quietly, whether this balance would preserve peace, or merely delay the next storm. More than a century later, historians would agree on one quiet truth, that the Battle of Waterloo did not simply end a war. It redirected the course of Europe in ways no treaty alone ever could, because its real power lived in consequences rather than celebration. On June 18, 1815, the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte closed an era defined by revolution, empire, and constant motion, forcing Europe's leaders to confront the cost of ambition pursued without restraint. The choices made in the aftermath, restoring monarchies, reinforcing alliances, and committing to a balance of power, shaped nearly 100 years of relative continental peace, not because conflict disappeared, but because memory restrained it. Britain emerged as a global stabilizer. Prussia began a rise that would later reshape Germany, and France was folded back into Europe rather than pushed permanently outside it. All decisions born from fear of repeating what had just been endured. The turning point of history lay not only in the battlefield's outcome, but in the restraint that followed, as rulers accepted that domination invited resistance, and that stability required compromise, patience, and shared responsibility. Waterloo taught Europe that victory carried obligations, and that peace demanded as much discipline as war. This legacy endured quietly, influencing diplomacy, borders, and institutions long after soldiers were buried and cannons silenced, shaping a continent that learned, at least for a time, to manage power rather than chase it. And as history continues to turn, the lesson remains unfinished, reminding every generation that battles may end in a single day, but the choices made afterward echo far beyond the horizon of memory.